Last time, we introduced Huntington's tomato soup theory, which states that the 3 million WASPs, white Anglo-Saxon Protestants, present before America's founding provided the core content of American identity. Thomas Jefferson specifically named this the American Creed. This core content includes 2 aspects: Protestant doctrine and British traditions. So, how did Protestant doctrine and British traditions, both foreign elements, become the American Creed? This involves a process of indigenization of ideas. When discussing America's founding history, people often mention the Mayflower of 1620. In fact, colonization had begun several years earlier. But from the beginning of colonization until independence in 1776, there was no concept of America as such, only 13 separate colonies. These 13 colonies had different origins. Some came directly from royal charters, while others formed when groups separated from existing settlements. For example, the Massachusetts colonial government stipulated that only Puritans could vote, and anyone spreading ideas that lead to the destruction of souls would be expelled. If they dare return secretly, their tongues would be branded with hot irons. Only Maryland opened its arms to Catholics. A Massachusetts minister named Roger Williams believed that the government had no right to force people to attend church, nor decide who was a heretic. Such ideas would certainly have earned him a branded tongue in Massachusetts, so he led his supporters to Rhode Island. After these heretics left, the remaining Puritans in Massachusetts still had differing opinions. Some felt the government was too strict, others not strict enough. Fearing punishment, they fled to Connecticut. People gather for business, but scatter over differences in opinion. Imagine voting on whether to brush teeth or rinse after eating. If those who prefer rinsing lose, they might think, starting tomorrow, I must brush after every meal? This life is unbearable. So they pack their belongings and move away. Back then, with abundant land and few people, relocation was easy. Thus, this loose collection of settlements became increasingly fragmented. Only when the Revolutionary War broke out and they had to fight Britain did they think about uniting, leading to the Continental Congress. Ironically, at this unity conference, representatives from various colonies weren't afraid of failing to unite, but rather of uniting too successfully. Their first consensus was, we're joining together, but we're not forming a single nation. They insisted on avoiding the word nation in their documents, using the United States instead. Did this mean Americans fundamentally rejected the concept of nationhood? Not at all. They believed they already had nations, their own colonies. After winning the Revolutionary War, Commander-in-Chief Washington planned a ceremony for soldiers to pledge allegiance to the newly established Federation. This order was never carried out because his messenger said, "My country is Virginia. I won't pledge allegiance to any federation." Washington considered this and let it go. It wasn't just soldiers who felt this way. Thomas Jefferson, who worked incredibly hard to become America's 3rd president, also considered Virginia his nation. In people's minds then, the Federation was merely a supranational organization, similar to today's European Union. If the Revolutionary War united the 13 colonies, why did Americans' mutual identification gradually deepen after victory instead of splitting into 13 independent countries? Huntington suggests 3 main reasons. First, identity requires enemies. In other words, cohesion needs common enemies. Goebbels once said, there's hatred. How wonderful. By the 20th century, with World War II and the Soviet threat, powerful enemies naturally encouraged unity. But why did America fall apart after the Revolutionary War? In this regard, America was fortunate. Beside the Revolutionary War, it fought Britain a second time and fought France once. Additionally, wars with Native Americans continued for 200 years. While Britain and France were powerful, they were distant. Native Americans were nearby but relatively weak. In short, these enemies were ideal, neither capable of inflicting significant harm nor failing to provide sufficient cohesion. Second, after winning independence, America created a groundbreaking written constitution. This made Americans deeply proud. Additionally, when WASPs came to America, their primary motivation wasn't economic but religious, to build a city upon a hill, to recreate Jerusalem. Therefore, This Constitution wasn't just a foundation for governance, but also embodied the WASP's spiritual transcendence. This transcendence crossed the boundaries of the 13 colonies, and the phrase "we the people" in the Constitution constructed a shared identity for all WASP members at the conceptual level. However, the decisive factor that ultimately made America a single nation rather than multiple nations was the last reason: the Civil War. Many explain the American Civil War from an economic perspective, saying the South needed slavery for cotton and tobacco plantations, while the North, focused on industry, needed free laborers and consumers, thus opposing slavery. This explanation doesn't hold up. In terms of production, what's the significant difference between slaves picking cotton in fields or tightening screws in factories? So, how did the Civil War begin? We need to look for ideological reasons. Looking back at the push for independence, it seems rather absurd now. Initially, Britain as a mother country didn't require North American colonies to pay taxes. But after fighting the French and deploying many troops at great expense, asking colonies to pay some taxes to share military costs wasn't unreasonable. Britain even clarified that not a single extra penny would flow into England. Yet over this issue, conflict erupted. After the conflict started, Britain conceded, "Fine, we'll drop the taxes," retaining only an insignificant tea tax purely to save face. But this wasn't acceptable either. The colonists dumped the tea into the sea, showing complete disrespect. So war broke out. During the war, Britain asked, "Why? Why?" The American side couldn't find any presentable reason, because Britain hadn't really done anything wrong. They could only insist that Britain was tyrannical, trampling principles of freedom and rule of law. Benjamin Franklin said, "We are only defending traditional British values." This resistance movement aims to maintain the British Constitution that every British person would approve, to preserve the freedom rights of Englishmen. It's like someone starting to sing at a pitch that's too high. Trouble follows. The Declaration of Independence made grandiose statements. "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness." Before the Revolutionary War, Britain had already abolished slavery. After winning independence, people began asking, if all men are created equal, did that include black people? This question created serious divisions. Some claimed black people didn't count as humans, so slavery was acceptable. Others couldn't accept this argument. Slavery became a thorn in many white Americans' conscience. Washington predicted that slavery would become America's greatest hidden danger. In his will, Washington stipulated that after his wife's death, all their slaves should be freed. His wife didn't even wait. The very next day, she freed all the household slaves. When America was first founded, it had only 13 colonies along a narrow strip on the Atlantic coast, with empty land to the west awaiting development. When discussing the formation of the Federation, smaller states feared that during westward expansion, they couldn't compete with the more populous larger states. So they forced everyone to agree that none of the 13 states would expand their territories. New territories in the West would form new states that could join the Federation when conditions were right. Should these newly established states allow slavery? A compromise was reached. New states would join the Federation in pairs, one free state and one slave state, to maintain the balance of power. This seemed like a good solution. Although the South fired the first shots in the Civil War, the North was really the instigator. Why? Because America was a deeply religious country where believers frequently became impassioned. Historically, there were 4 great awakenings in American religious history. Each religious awakening was a powerful ideological force reshaping American society. The first Great Awakening led to the Revolutionary War. The direct result of the Second Great Awakening was abolition. At that time, various religious groups, inspired by God, established abolition societies. Harriet Beecher Stowe's Uncle Tom's Cabin was adapted into plays performed everywhere. People brought handkerchiefs to these performances, weeping openly, handkerchiefs in hand. In short, abolitionist sentiment grew increasingly strong in the North. But there were no economic considerations behind abolition. The notion that the North needed free black people as workers and consumers is unfounded. Even President Lincoln's idea was to have freed black people return Africa. As early as 1821, the American Colonization Society exchanged tobacco, rum, and small mirrors, worth about $300, for a piece of land from an African chief to settle freed black people. This land became today's Liberia. However, this plan for black people to return Africa ultimately failed for two reasons. First, it was too expensive, and second, life in Africa was too harsh. Originally, the slave states of the South only wanted to secede from the Union. They could have simply announced this, and who could have stopped them? Looking back, it's hard to understand why the South fired first. Once they did, there was no turning back. Not counting civilians, more than 600,000 soldiers died in the Civil War, with casualties exceeding America's combined losses in World Wars I and II. Considering the smaller population base then, this price was truly devastating. The famous American historian Daniel Boorstin, author of the Americans trilogy, said, "The Civil War was the costliest factor in forging this nation." Reflecting on America's founding history always evokes deep emotion. The first settlers who crossed the ocean to North America, those Edmund Burke called the Dissenters of Dissent, the Protestants of the Protestant religion, originally despised royal authority and were most negative toward public political affairs. In other words, they were the group most averse to government. Yet these people ultimately, united as one, completed their shared identity as Americans and established the United States. You could attribute the fact that the original 13 colonies didn't split into 13 independent countries to Washington's high prestige, the advent of railroads and telegraphs, the bloodshed of the Civil War, the Great Depression's expansion of federal authority, World War II and the subsequent Cold War, and so on. But the most fundamental reason must be sought in religion. Tocqueville said, "Upon my arrival in the United States, the first thing that struck me was a religious atmosphere. The longer I stayed, the more I could see its enormous political consequences. In France, religion and liberty are opposed, but in America, they've successfully combined religious spirit with the spirit of freedom. It was faith in God that gave Americans a sense of mission, to rebuild Jerusalem, to build a city upon a hill according to God's will." We'll emphasize this point again when we discuss Russell Kirk later. Christianity provided the greatest foundation for America's order. Without recognizing this, one cannot truly understand America. It was also faith in God that led Wilson to propose his 14 points after World War I, aiming to replace imperialist colonialism with national self-determination principles globally. This directly expanded World War I scale and indirectly led to World War II, bringing unprecedented disaster to humanity. Yet after winning World War II and the Cold War, America led the establishment of a global trade system. This system has helped humanity avoid full-scale war for 70 years while achieving unprecedented economic development. Paul Johnson said, "America is a God-fearing country in every respect." This is an important reason why America is different. I believe it's the most important reason. Regarding American characteristics or the foundation of American identity, renowned political scientist Seymour Martin Lipset summarized 5 core values: liberty, equality, individualism, democracy, and economic laissez-faire. All 5 principles derive from Protestant teachings. The progress of human civilization in the 20th century was profoundly changed by these 5 principles and by Americans' faith in God. So what challenges do the core components of American identity, what Thomas Jefferson called the American Creed, face today? Can they continue to be maintained? I'm Oliver, and I'll see you in the next video.